1400 to 1590. Tactics. The most typical forms of Ottoman warfare were sieges and skirmishes along the borders of the empire. Field battles were rare, but, when they happened they were often decisive. The Battle of Varna, for example, in 1444 determined that it was the Ottomans and not the Hungarians who were to be the dominant power in the Balkan Peninsula. The Ottoman conquest of Syria and Egypt in 1516 and 1517 was the outcome of the two battles at Marj Dobik and Radania. It was the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 that put an end to the independent Kingdom of Hungary. The formation of the Ottoman army in the field seems to have remained, in essence, unchanged between the late 14th and late 16th centuries. It was overwhelmingly a cavalry army with, as a rule, the Anatolian and Rumelian cavalry positioned separately on each wing. In the center stood the Janissaries, who also guarded the Sultan, if he was leading the army in person. Although they were infantrymen and few in number, it was the Janissaries who provided a stable core for the Ottoman battle line. The near defeat which the Ottomans suffered in the Hungarian wars of the mid-15th century spurred them to make greater use of firearms and to adopt the Hungarian tactic of the Wagenburg. The disposition of the forces in the field, however, with the Janissaries in the center and the cavalry on the wings, seems to have remained unchanged. The difference was that the center of the field which the Janissaries occupied had become a strongly fortified position. It was, probably, too, after the Hungarian wars that the Janissaries began to carry firearms. These were to prove particularly effective in the wars against Uzun Hasan in the early 1470s. Lacking firearms himself, Uzun Hasan attempted but failed to obtain a supply from Venice 40 and, in his encounter with the Ottoman army, this lack was crucial. The Ottoman chronicler, Neshri, records that Uzun Hasan had never seen a battle with cannon and arquebus and so was powerless before the Ottomans. And Apos. The Venetian Chronicle of Malipiero makes the same point. The Turks prevailed because the Persian cavalry were not accustomed to artillery battles and fled before the beginning of the fight. Bayezid too improved the quality of the Janissaries' arquebuses, following reverses in the war with the Mamluks in Cilicia between 1485 and 1490. At this stage, it was only the Janissaries who carried firearms. Arquebuses were not practical on horseback, and the irregular infantry, the Azubs, probably did not serve long enough to learn the effective use of the weapon. It was only in the late 16th century that gunpowder weapons developed that were suitable for use on horseback, and only in the second half of the same century that firearms became sufficiently widespread to make it possible to recruit arquebusiers from among the general population. During the second half of the 15th century and for much of the 16th, therefore, handguns were an important element in Ottoman battle field tactics, especially in defending the fortified position at the center. Their use, however, was restricted in what was essentially a cavalry army. Two accounts from the first half of the 16th century give a good picture of the Ottoman order of battle at this period. One of these appears in Selim I's victory proclamation following the Battle of Marj Dobik in 1516. The Sultan himself was at the center of the battle line with his Janissary bodyguards. In the front were 10,000 infantrymen, including arquebusiers, presumably Janissaries. In front of these were 300 gun carts. On either side were horsemen from the 6 divisions, with the Crimeans and the Timar holding cavalry of Anatolia and Rumelia on each wing. Some years later, in about 1541, Paolo Giovo gave an account of the order of battle, which largely confirms, but with more detail, what appears in Selim I's proclamation. The Sultan, he said, took up his position in the center, under the protection of the Solaks, the inner group of Janissaries who acted as his bodyguard, and Janissaries. Most of these carried long arquebuses. On the right and left were the cavalry of the 6 divisions. In front of the Janissaries were the cannon and, further to the front, the Azubs. Another group of Azubs guarded the rear of the army. The Rumelian and Anatolian cavalrymen were ranged on either wing of the frontmost Azubs. Jovio also mentions the role of the raiders. These rode in front of the army and lured the enemy into contact with the Azubs. These troops the Sultan probably regarded as largely dispensable. Already in 1475, Jacopo di Promontorio had commented, "When it comes to an engagement, they are sent ahead like pigs, without any mercy, and they die in great numbers." When the Azubs gave way and divided, the enemy next encountered the Ottoman artillery and then, behind the cannon, the Janissaries. The role of the cavalry on the wings was to encircle the enemy as they approached this fortified position in the center of the Ottoman line. 41. The commander of the Habsburg forces in Hungary between 1564 and 1568, Lazarus Schwendi, is a witness to the effectiveness of these tactics. He is emphatic that the Christian forces should not allow the Ottomans to lure them to within reach of the Wagenburg, the mobile fortification in the center of the line. He comments, too, on the excellence of the Janissaries as marksmen. 42 There are about 12,000 arquebusiers with long arquebuses which they manage excellently. And Apos. Other Europeans, for example, at the Ottoman siege of Malta in 1565, also comment on the accurate fire of the Janissaries. Schwendi, it would seem, regarded the Ottomans as invincible on the battlefield, and during the summer, when they could mobilize a full army, he advised instead that the Austrians attack border fortresses in winter, when the Ottomans could not resist effectively, and that good and well-equipped fortresses were the best way to defeat the Turks. Schwendi's attitude is defensive, indicating that Ottoman battlefield tactics remained effective at least until the end of the wars of the 1560s. 43. In identifying well-equipped fortresses as the best weapon against the Ottomans, Schwendi was also typifying the warfare of the period. Sieges were more common than battles in the open field, and were a form of warfare in which the Ottomans came to excel. In the early 14th century, they had been able to reduce castles and fortified towns only by starving them into submission. By the end of the century they had successfully adopted the equipment and techniques of medieval siegecraft, using mangonels to hurl stones against and over the walls, siege towers to give the attacking troops a fighting platform from which to assault the defenders on the ramparts, and mantlets to protect themselves from missiles. They had also learned the art of mining. They continued to use these techniques for long after the 14th century. In 1453, for example, it was cannon fire that breached the walls of Constantinople, but cannon was only one of the weapons which the Ottomans used to batter the city's defenses. The Ottoman chronicler, Tursun Bey, reports that Mehmed II also brought up mangonels and sank mines beneath the walls. The accounts of European defenders also refer to siege towers. These and other obsolete methods of siegecraft continued into the following century. There are references to the use of mantlets at the siege of Otranto in 1481, Malta in 1565 and Nicosia in 1570, and to the use of mangonels at the siege of Rhodes in 1522. At Malta in 1565, the attackers constructed a siege tower which could hold 5 or 6 arquebusiers. Mining too remained a speciality of the Ottoman siege engineers. 44. Nonetheless, from the mid-15th century, artillery came to be the crucial factor in sieges. The function of cannon was to destroy fortifications, but Ottoman ordnance from the mid-15th century also included mortars for firing over the walls to demolish buildings and terrorize the population within. It seems, for example, to have been a giant mortar that destroyed the morale of the inhabitants at the Ottoman siege of Mytilene in 1462.45. Artillery was one element in siege warfare. Equally important was the work of sappers and miners in digging the approach trenches and constructing the earthworks which protected the besiegers and their artillery from enemy fire, and in undermining the walls of the fortress. These were arts in which the Ottomans excelled. There was, by the 17th century, a separate corps of sappers, but it is not clear when this came into existence. It is possible that such work had previously been the duty of the exemptees and footmen. The first stage in a siege was to defeat any force that was outside the walls and to confine the enemy to the fortress. Then, under the cover of darkness, the sappers would dig the approach trenches at right angles to the walls. These were sinuous, to give protection from enemy shot, which otherwise would have gone straight from one end of the trench to the other. From these approaches, trenches radiated at right angles, parallel to the walls. Once these were complete, the Ottoman besiegers brought up artillery and gabions and, when these were in place, began the bombardment. 46 The gabions, which served to protect the sappers and soldiers in the trenches, drew the attention of the French traveler, de Nicolet, who witnessed them at the siege of Tripoli in 1551. The gabions are made of large planks, 3 inches thick. When the Turks wished to attack some position, they set them up on the ground, in the form of a lozenge, hinging the planks one within the other. Then, when they have been placed in rows, they fill them with earth. This is a very useful invention, because the shot can only glance off them and do them no harm or damage. As the trenches approached the ditch before the fort, the besiegers would often use the spoil from the excavation, or the rubble which the cannon had dislodged from the fortress, to level the ditch and approach the wall. In describing the siege of Famagusta in 1572, Bizarri reports how the Turks had already thrown so much earth against the ditch that they had leveled the way up to the ramparts and Apos, and then put transverse joists and beams on both sides to serve as supports. These stretched right to the wall, and so that we could do no harm to them with our cannon, they protected them with wattle, sacks of wool and fascins. And Apos. The trenches were the most essential element in siege works, as They provided cover, and it was through them that men and artillery approached the fortress. Ottoman siegecraft, however, also involved more elaborate undertakings. The 14th and 15th centuries sometimes saw the construction of blockading fortresses to prevent access to the place which was under siege. In the 1390s, Bayezid I built a castle on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus to impede access to Constantinople as he brought the city under siege. For the same purpose, in 1452-3, Mehmed II built a second castle opposite Bayezid's, on the European shore. In 1440, Murad II opened his unsuccessful siege of Belgrade with the construction of a blockading fort to the south of the city. Most such works, however, the Ottomans constructed immediately outside the fortress or city under siege. For example, they opened the siege of Nicosia 47 in 157,048 by constructing a fortress on the mountain which bears the name St. Marina, 170 paces distant from the bastions and boulevards of Patacataro and Carassa and Apos. From here, they began to fire into the city, hitting houses and other buildings, but without causing much damage. They next set up a fort on a hill which the inhabitants call St. George, firing at the roofs of the houses, but again without harming the defenses. 2. More forts followed, and only when they could knock down the defenses of the city from these positions did the attackers move nearer. The next stage of the operation demonstrated how the Ottomans could also construct fortresses much closer to the city walls. When the besieging force approached the counterscarp of the ditch around the old city of Nicosia, they excavated and made terraces that were almost equal to our fortresses called Patacataro, Constantia, Annaba and Tripoli. Facing these, they built 4 fine fortresses, with great work and diligence, about 50 paces from our walls. From these positions they were able to pound the walls. Similar works appeared at the siege of Famagusta in 1572. Bizarri describes how, at the beginning of the siege, the Turks began to set up platforms to place cannon for the bombardment, and to make casemates and bastions for arquebus fire and Apos, at the same time as the besieging forces constructed these earth and rubble fortifications above the ground. Their miners would excavate below the earth. The original method was to construct a chamber beneath the fortress walls or towers, and to coat wooden props, which supported the roof with pitch or other combustible material. The miners would then fire the props and withdraw. As the roof of the mine collapsed, so too would the masonry above the ground. In the 16th century, the use of gunpowder to fire mines increased the destructive effects of the technique. Gunpowder did, however, bring greater risks. At the siege of Famagusta, a large number of the besiegers lost their lives when an Ottoman mine exploded beneath their feet. The final stage of the siege, when cannon fire and mining had reduced the fortification and gunshot and arrows decimated the defenders, was a general assault, when the besieging force attempted to enter through the breaches in the wall. Once an Ottoman army had entered a fortress, town or city, there was no hope of effective resistance.